Good afternoon. My name is Tom Burnett, and it is my distinct honor to welcome you to the 13th Annual Lunch with Legends, the League of Women Voters fundraising event benefiting the Civic Leader Scholarships that we award each year to outstanding high school seniors in Moore County. Today, in celebration of Women's History Month, we'll hear the stories of two legendary women who helped shape the course of our nation's histories. Today's legends have more than just enduring historical value. The two women we honor today each left a legacy that affects the lives of millions of Americans each and every year. Now, although we can't all be together in person this year, we can still celebrate these historic women who, with courage, intelligence, and perseverance, made so many things attainable for the women who followed them. And so, this year, we're reaching back into our archives once again to celebrate two legends who we previously honored, Abigale Adams in 2009 and Francis Perkins in 2011. If these presentations are new to you, we hope you enjoy learning about these two incredible women. If you were here with us in 2009 and 2011, we hope your second time will be as enlightening as it was the first time. So please, relax, enjoy your lunch, and take a trip with us back into history with Abigale Adams and Francis Perkins. Abigale Adams was born on November 11th, 1744, to Elizabeth Quincy and William Smith. She was taught to read and write at home and given access to the extensive libraries of her father and grandfather. She was especially interested in philosophy, theology, Shakespeare, the classics, ancient history, government, and the law.
I married John on October 25th, 1764, 5 days after his 29th birthday, when I was 19. He was a lawyer, and we were married in my family home by my father, Pastor William Smith. After the reception, we mounted a single horse and rode off to our new home, the small cottage and farm that John had inherited from his father in Braintree, Massachusetts. We lived there before moving to Boston, where John practiced law. In the next 10 years, we had 6 children, although our youngest, Elizabeth, was stillborn in 1777. I looked after my home and children while John was traveling as a circuit court judge. I missed him dearly while he was traveling, and in December 1773, I looked out the window as I wrote, "How many snowbanks divide thee and me?"
Adams is remembered for the many letters she wrote to her husband while he stayed in Philadelphia during the Continental Congresses. John Adams frequently sought the advice of his wife on many matters, and their letters are filled with intellectual discussions on government and politics. The letters are invaluable eyewitness accounts of the Revolutionary War home front and the development of our young democracy. In a November 27, 1775 letter to John, Abigale expressed her concerns about the task in forming a new government.
The building of a great empire, which was only hinted at by my correspondent, may now, I suppose, be realized even by the unbelievers. Yet will not 10,000 difficulties arise in the formation of it? The reins of government have been so long slackened that I fear the people will not quietly submit to those restraints, which are necessary for the peace and security of the community. If we separate from Britain, what code of laws will be established? How shall we be governed? As to retain our liberties, can any government be free which is not administered by general stated laws? Who shall frame these laws? Who will give them force and energy? It is true your resolutions as a body have heretofore had the force of laws, but will they continue to have? When I consider these things and the prejudices of people in favor of ancient customs and regulations. I feel anxious for the fate of our monarchy or democracy or whatever is to take place. I soon get lost in a labyrinth of perplexities, but whatever occurs, may justice and righteousness be the stability of our times, and order arise out of confusion. Great difficulties may be surmounted by patience and perseverance.
As the colonial fight for independence from the mother country continued, Abigale was appointed by the Massachusetts Colony General Court in 1775, along with Mercy Warren and the governor's wife, Hannah Winthrop, to question their fellow Massachusetts women who were charged by their word or action of remaining loyal to the British Crown and working against the independence movement. You are now a politician and now elected into an important office, that of judges of Tory ladies, which will give you naturally an influence with your sex, her husband wrote to her in response to the appointment. This was the first instance of a first lady who held any quasi-official government position. As the Second Continental Congress drew up and debated the Declaration of Independence through 1776, Abigale began to press the argument in her letters that the creation of a new form of government was an opportunity to make equitable the legal status of women to that of men. Despite her inability to convince them of this, the text of those letters became some of the earliest known writings calling for women's equal rights. And on March 31st, 1776, Abigale wrote her famous "Remember the Ladies" admonition in this letter to John.
I long to hear that you have declared an independence. And by the way, in the new code of laws, which I suppose will be necessary for you to make, I desire you would remember the ladies and be more generous and favorable to them than your ancestors. Do not put such unlimited power into the hands of the husbands. Remember, all men would be tyrants if they could. If particular care and attention is not paid to the ladies, we are determined to foment a rebellion, and will not hold ourselves bound by any laws in which we have not voice or representation. That your sex are naturally tyrannical is a truth so thoroughly established as to admit of no dispute. But such of you as wish to be happy willingly give up the harsh title of master for the more tender and endearing one of friend. Why then not put it out of the power of the vicious and lawless to use us with cruelty and indignity with impunity? Men of sense in all ages abhor these customs which treat us only as a vessel of their sex. Regard us then as being placed by Providence under your protection, and in imitation of the Supreme Being, make use of that power only for our happiness.
Several weeks later, John responded, "We know better than to repeal our masculine systems. In practice, you know we are the subjects. We have only the name of masters, and rather than give up this, which would completely subject us to the despotism of the petticoat, I hope General Washington and all our brave heroes would fight." The formal signing of the Declaration of Independence did not take place until August. In the meantime, the document was widely published, and Abigale duly recorded one of its many public readings in a short, joyous letter to John on July 21st, 1776.
Last Thursday, after hearing a very good sermon, I went with the multitudes into King Street to hear the Proclamation of Independence read and proclaimed. Some field pieces with the train were brought here. The troops appeared under arms, and all the inhabitants assembled there when Colonel Crafts read from the balcony of the State House the proclamation. Great attention was given to every word. As soon as he ended, the cry from the balcony was, "God save our American states." And then 3 cheers rent the air. The bells rang. The privateers fired. The forts and batteries and the cannon were discharged. The platoons followed, and every face appeared joyful. Mr. Baldwin then gave a sentiment, stability and perpetuity to American independence. After dinner, the King's arms were taken down from the State House, and every vestige of him from every place in which it appeared was burned in King Street. Thus ends royal authority in this state, and all of the people say, Amen.
In 1784, Abigail and her daughter Nabby joined her husband and her eldest son, John Quincy, at her husband's diplomatic post in Paris. After 1785, she filled the role of wife of the first United States minister to the Kingdom of Great Britain. They returned in 1788 to a house known as the Old House in Quincy, formerly Braintree, Massachusetts, which she set about vigorously enlarging and remodeling. Nabby later died of breast cancer, having endured 3 years of severe pain. As much of her political role was conducted in correspondence, so too was Abigail's active interest in her husband's 2 presidential campaigns in 1796 and 1800, when his primary challenger was their close friend, anti-federalist Thomas Jefferson. Caring for John's dying mother, Abigail was unable to attend his March 4th, 1797 inaugural ceremony in Philadelphia. She was highly conscious, however, of how their lives would change that day. She wrote the following letter to John on February 8th, 1797.
You have this day to declare yourself head of a nation. My thoughts and my meditations are with you, though personally absent, and my petitions to heaven are that the things which make for peace may not be hidden from your eyes. My feelings are not those of pride or ostentation upon the occasion. They are solemnized by a sense of the obligations, the important trust, the numerous duties connected with it, that you may be able to discharge them with honor to yourself, with justice and impartiality to your country, and with satisfaction to this great people, shall be the daily prayer of your most affectionate wife.
Of the 4 years her husband served as president, Abigale Adams was actually present in the temporary capital of Philadelphia, and then finally the permanent federal city of Washington, D.C., for a total of only 18 months. When she moved to the new capital in 1800, Abigail became the first lady to preside over the White House, or President's House as it was then known. The city was wilderness, the President's house far from completion. She found the unfinished mansion in Washington habitable and the location beautiful, but complained that despite the thick woods nearby, she could find no one willing to chop and haul firewood for the first family. During that time, she famously hung her family's laundry in the unfinished East Room to dry. Although her health, never robust, suffered well in Washington, she took an active role in politics and policy unprecedented by her predecessor, Martha Washington. She was so politically active that her political opponents came to refer to her as Mrs. President. After her husband lost his bid for re-election to Thomas Jefferson, Abigail still remained interested in national political issues, but her focus was primarily on her home and her family. She described her feelings of leaving Washington and the White House in a letter dated November 13th, 1800, that she wrote to her son, Thomas.
Well, my dear son, South Carolina has behaved as your father always said she would. The consequences to us personally is that we retire from public life. For myself and family, I have few regrets. At my age, with my bodily infirmities, I shall be happier in Quincy. Neither my habits nor my education nor inclinations have led me to an expensive style of living, so that on that score I have little to mourn over. If it did not rise with dignity, I can at least fall with ease, which is the more difficult task. I feel not any resentment against those who are coming into power, and only wish the future administration of the government may be as productive of the peace, happiness, and prosperity of the nation as the two former ones have been. I leave to time the unfolding of a drama. I leave to posterity to reflect upon the times past, and I leave them characters to contemplate. My own intention is to return to Quincy as soon as I conveniently can.
The Adamses retired to Quincy, Massachusetts in 1801 after John's defeat for a second term. Although Abigail was taught to read and write at home, in her later life, she was known for advocating for a public school education for girls that was equal to that given to boys. As an intellectually open-minded woman for her day, Abigail's ideas on women's rights and government would eventually play a major role, albeit indirectly, in the founding of the United States. She became one of the most erudite women ever to serve as First Lady. At the age of 73, Abigale Adams died on October 28, 1818, of typhoid fever. Her last words were,
"Do not grieve, my friend, my dearest friend. I am ready to go, and John, it will not be long."
Fanny Corley Perkins was born April 10, 1880 in Boston, to an upper-middle-class Republican family. When she was 2 years old, the family relocated to Worcester, Massachusetts, where her father opened a profitable stationery business. She spent her childhood there. Her parents, both devout Congregationalists, instilled in Fanny a strong desire to live for God and to accomplish something in life.
I knew by the time I was 10 years old that I would never be a beautiful woman, and I would not be able to open any doors to my future with my looks. I learned that one day in 1890 when I was shopping for hats with my mother. We looked in a shop window at the beautiful hats of the day, long and slim, with colored ribbons and flowers and feathers. My mother passed over the pretty hats and pointed at a simple three-cornered tricorn style hat like the hats worn by the Revolutionary soldiers. "There, my dear, is your hat," she told me matter-of-factly. "You should always wear a hat something like this. You have a very broad face. It's wider in the middle than it is at the top. Never let yourself get a hat that is narrower than your cheekbones because it will make you look ridiculous."
That hat would come to symbolize the plain, sturdy woman who became Francis Perkins, and the mother's blunt advice to an awkward young girl left a lasting impression. From her earliest days, she felt out of step with the women of her time, including her mother and sister. Fanny graduated from the predominantly male Worcester Classical High School and went on to attend Mount Holyoke Women's College, graduating with a BA in Chemistry and Physics in 1902, and from Columbia University with a master's degree in Political Science in 1910. Trained as a teacher, she taught at numerous universities and authored 2 books. She's best described as a woman with a mission, but not as a single-issue person. She was prone to women's causes, and she highly valued individual liberty. She was very active in the women's suffrage movement, marching in suffrage parades, and giving street corner speeches.
When I finished college in 1902, I traveled to New York City in search of some type of social work. I went to the office of the Charity Organization Society, the precursor to the United Way. Social work was still a new field then, and the COS had a reputation for attracting the best in the profession.
Undetermined by her youth and inexperience, she demanded an interview with Edward T. Devine, the group's director. After declining to be interviewed by any other staff member, he finally agreed. He asked her what she wanted to do, and she said,
I want to see the poor, give them help, and untangle their problems.
Well, that's very interesting. What would you do if you were sent out to a family who had applied for help, and you came into their tenement and you found the father drunk on the bed, the children done up with sore throats and sick, no food in the house, and the mother was bustling around, pretty disheveled and disorderly looking, dishes piled high in the sink, and it was obvious that the drunken father had just beaten his wife? What would you do?
Well, I would send for the police at once and have the man arrested, of course.
The smile on Devine's face broadened, and he said, that isn't exactly what we would recommend. Explaining to her that the best way to rehabilitate the family was to get the parents back to work, sober them up, teach them to help themselves. He told Fanny that she was too young, unworldly, and inexperienced for the work, and she lacked the judgment and life experience to effectively help those in need.
So I returned home to Worcester. My parents didn't want me to pursue graduate work. They preferred that I begin looking for a suitor and get married. I wrote to my Mount Holyoke classmates and told them that when nothing turned up for me, I made it my mission to stay at home and make my family miserable. I took various teacher positions and volunteered my time working at settlement houses, where I learned firsthand the dangerous conditions of factory work in those days and the desperations of workers unable to collect their promised wages or secure medical treatment for workplace injuries.
In 1904, Fanny left Worcester to teach science at a women's college in Chicago. She had corresponded with the school by mail and took the job sight unseen. Desperate to escape Worcester, she prepared to head west away from her family, which she was finding anything but inspiring. They were boring, smug, and content with their lot. Fanny took up her duties at Ferry Hall in Lake Forest, Illinois, a women's college for affluent young ladies. In Lake Forest and Chicago, Fanny would begin her lifetime pattern of moving simultaneously in two worlds, mixing with the elite while advocating reforms to benefit the poor. From the moment she arrived in Chicago, she reinvented herself. She changed her name to Francis, her faith to Episcopalian, and she became a Democrat.
In the summer of 1909, I decided to move to New York City to study for my master's degree while surveying the living and working conditions there. In 1910, I became head of the National Consumers Union League, the NCL. I lobbied for better working hours and working conditions, and then for 2 years I served as secretary. I was successful in lobbying the state legislature for a bill to limit the work week to 54 hours for both women and children. Then, in 1911, 100 years ago this month, I watched helplessly as 146 workers, most of them young women, died in the Triangle Shirtwaist Fire. Many clasped their hands in prayer before they leaped to their deaths from the upper floor windows of a tenement building that lacked fire escapes. It was seared on my mind as well as my heart, a never-to-be-forgotten reminder of why I had to spend my life fighting conditions that could permit such a tragedy.
In her role as a social worker and political activist, Perkins felt that
poverty is preventable, destructive, wasteful, and demoralizing. In the midst of potential plenty, it is morally unacceptable in a Christian and democratic society because the poor are people with hopes, fears, virtues, vices, and they are fellow citizens.
Her focus was the improvement of the quality of life for all. Because she devoted most of her time to enhancing the public welfare, Perkins' diverse efforts were viewed by her enemies as liberal. However, she overcame many of the restrictions and prejudices of her era, especially in the areas that were dominated by men. In 1913, Francis, at age 33, married Paul Caldwell Wilson, an economist and budget expert in the New York Bureau of Municipal Research. She retained her maiden name and had to defend the right to do so in court, but briefly withdrew from public service after her marriage and the birth of her daughter. About the time she resumed her public and political career, her husband suffered an emotional breakdown from which he never fully recovered. Her personal life, however, was just that. She managed to keep her husband and daughter away from the public eye.
By 1918, I was back at my pursuit of reform and was appointed by New York Governor Al Smith to the State Industrial Commission. I was honored to be named its chairman in 1926. 2 years later, then Governor Franklin D. Roosevelt promoted me to be the Industrial Commissioner of New York, the chief post in the State Labor Department. I continued my efforts to expand factory investigations, reduce the work week to 48 hours for women, and facilitate minimum wage and unemployment insurance laws. In February of 1933, I met with President-elect Roosevelt. He wanted me to take on another assignment, but I had decided that I would not do it unless he let me do it my own way. I read to him the list of items that I wanted: a 40-hour work week, a minimum wage, workers' compensation, unemployment compensation, a federal law banning child labor, direct federal aid of unemployment relief, Social Security, a revitalized public employment service, and health insurance. I watched his eyes to make sure he was paying attention, then braced myself for his response. I was proposing a fundamental and radical restructuring of American society with enactment of historical and social welfare. I reminded him nothing like this had ever been done in the United States before. Roosevelt was about to inherit the worst economic crisis in the nation's history. His choice of labor secretary would be one of his most important early decisions. No one was more qualified for this job than I was. I knew as much about labor law and administration as anyone in the country. He had known me for more than 20 years, the last 4 in Albany, where I had worked at his side. He knew I would never betray him. But putting a woman in the labor secretary's job would expose him to criticism and ridicule. My list of proposals would stir heated opposition, even among his most loyal supporters. I waited for his response. Then he said he would back me. It was a job I had waited for all of my life. I had changed my name, my appearance, and even my age to make myself a more effective labor advocate. I had studied how men think so I could better succeed in a man's world, and I spent decades building crucial alliances. But I still needed to think about it. Then I remembered what my grandmother had always told me. When a door opened to you, you had no choice but to walk through it. At that time, I thought, the door might not be open to a woman again for a long, long time. And I had a kind of duty to other women to walk in and sit down on the chair that was offered. and so established the right of others long hence and far distant in geography to sit in the high seats. The next day, I called Franklin Roosevelt and accepted his offer to become the nation's first female Secretary of Labor.
As Secretary of Labor, Perkins played a key role in the cabinet by writing New Deal legislation, including minimum wage laws. Her most important contribution, however, came in 1934 as chair of the President's Committee on Economic Security. In this post, she was involved in all aspects of the reports and hearings that ultimately resulted in the Social Security Act of 1935.
My diligence and hard work was also rewarded in 1935 with passage of the National Labor Relations Act, which gave workers the right to collective bargaining and created the National Labor Relations Board. I was best described as a strong advocate for government intervention for the public good, and my involvement and persuasive ventures usually led to victory. You must remember, this was a time in our history when working conditions in America were as bad for Americans as conditions are today for workers in the sweatshops of third world countries. When the Fair Labor Standards Act passed in 1938, I had managed to persuade Congress to eliminate labor conditions detrimental to the maintenance of minimum standards of living necessary for the health, efficiency, and well-being of workers.
Francis Perkins, the first female member of a presidential cabinet, had an unenviable challenge. She had to be as capable, as fearless, as tactful, as politically astute as the other Washington politicians in order to make it possible for other women to be accepted in the halls of power after her. Perkins would have been famous simply by being the first woman cabinet member, but her legacy stems from her accomplishments. She had a cool personality which held her aloof from the crowd, although her results indicated great love of workers and lower class groups. Her Boston upbringing held her back from mingling freely and exhibiting personal affection. She was well suited for the high-level efforts to effect sweeping reforms, but never really caught the public's eye or its affection.
One time, my actions on behalf of labor angered many business leaders, and in 1939, the House Un-American Activities Committee brought an impeachment resolution against me when I refused to deport the head of the West Coast Longshore Union. The impeachment proceedings were eventually dropped for lack of evidence. I continued to serve in my cabinet post for the full 12 years of Roosevelt's administration. I resigned in 1945, after his death, to head the U.S. delegation to the International Labor Organization Conference in Paris.
President Truman subsequently appointed her to the Civil Service Commission, a job which she held through 1953. In the last years of her life, she assumed a professorship at Cornell University's School of Industrial and Labor Relations. Francis Perkins died in New York at the age of 85. The Francis Perkins Building, that is headquarters of the United States Department of Labor in Washington, D.C., was named in her honor in 1980. The dour-looking figure in the tricorn hat, the image seen through the years in film strips and photographs in the background, disguised a woman whose intelligence, compassion, creative genius, and fierce loyalty made her an exceptional figure in modern American history.
If tomorrow all the things were gone I'd worked for all my life, and I had to start again with just my children and my wife, I'd thank my lucky stars to be living here today, for the flag still stands for freedom and they can't take that away. And I'm proud to be an American, where at least I know I'm free. And I won't forget the ones who died and gave that right to me. And I gladly stand up next to you and defend her still today. For there ain't no doubt I love this land. God bless the USA. From the lakes of Minnesota to the hills of Tennessee, across the plains of Texas, from sea to shining sea, from Detroit down to Houston, the sand hills to LA, there's pride in every American heart, and it's time we stand and say that I'm proud to be an American, where at least I know I'm free. And I won't forget the ones who died and gave that right to me. And I'd gladly stand up next to you and defend her still today. For there ain't no doubt I love this land. God bless the USA. Yes, I'm proud to be an American, where at least I know I'm free. And I won't forget the ones who died and gave that right to me. And I gladly stand up next to you and defend her still today. For there ain't no doubt I love this land. God bless the